Can a single witness interview change the entire trajectory of a case? The answer is definitely yes. And in this video, we're going to go through 3 cases that I worked on, 2 that were civil plaintiff litigation and 1 that was an internal investigation in which one single interview literally changed the trajectory of that case. Hey, my name is Mike Corwin, and I spent 30 years conducting civil plaintiff and criminal defense litigation investigations for attorneys, as well as conducting internal investigations for businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies. And I now work with businesses and law firms in helping to make sure that their staff level up their witness interviews to maximize their results. If you'd like to schedule a call and learn more about the services I provide and how they can help your team level up your interviews and maximize your revenue and also get the best, most powerful facts that you can in order to make decisions. In the first case I want to talk about, this was a civil plaintiff case involving a police shooting, and the person who was killed was actually shot to death in their pajamas in their backyard by 2 members of the Albuquerque Police Department. And because of the location of where this shooting occurred, the law enforcement version was that the decedent had tried to take their weapon from them, and so they shot him literally in self-defense. Now, when I was brought in on this case, it was as soon as the shootings happened. There were no police reports yet. There weren't even dispatch calls to prepare for witness interviews. The attorney had me go out and canvass the neighborhood, the way that I made sure I got all of the neighbors and people who might have a chance to actually have seen what went on. And when I got to the final house, which was the house directly behind the decedent's home, there was a woman home, and it turned out that this woman was the person who had called 911, and she had witnessed through a little hole in the fence pretty much the entire incident leading up to and at the time of the shooting. So literally, I became the first person to talk with the person who actually called in this situation. And what she had to say directly contradicted what the 2 officers involved in the shooting said. Now keep in mind, there was nobody else home at the house. There was no one else in the yard when the shooting occurred. So literally, until we interviewed this person, the only version that there was that based upon the 2 officers. Now, when I interviewed her, she was very clear that this supposed struggle between the officers and the decedent grabbing the officer's gun didn't happen. So now we have 2 very, very different versions of events. We've got one in which the officers acted in self-defense. We have the other in which, in fact, not only did the officers not act in self-defense, but the actions they attributed to the decedent did not occur. And instead, they shot him in the back while he was on the ground on all 4s. No struggle involved. When this case went forward, it took 2 years for law enforcement to conduct an internal investigation into this shooting and actually interview this person. That's despite law enforcement having the 911 dispatch records to know and be able to identify the person who called in the emergency situation in the first place. They did not do so, which is not different from many internal investigations where they're really not after an outcome based upon the facts. They're actually interested in a skewed outcome. Now, there are many times that officers testify that their lives are being threatened, that their safety is being threatened, and that when they shoot someone, it literally is in self-defense. We ended up going to trial, and at trial, the judge ruled that the officer's testimony was not credible, that the witness that I had interviewed, that her statement was in fact credible, and that it did not appear in any way, shape, or form that the officers had acted in self-defense. What that really meant was taking the case from its officers, and they're united in their testimony acting in self-defense, to an independent eyewitness who credibly testified at the trial about what she saw, and as a result, the judge dismissed what the officers had to say because the judge found the witness that I had interviewed to be credible. And that really did change the entire scope of this case. Here's an internal investigation where one single interview altered the outcome of this case. I was doing independent fact-finding of internal allegations on behalf of the City of Albuquerque's Employee Equity Office. One of their employees, who happened to be a center director of an early childhood education center, who was accused of actually hitting a young child on the head. Now, we're talking about an actual strike, not just a little tiny tap, not just a please pay attention. This was legitimately a strike on top of the head, and we know that there's definite safety risks for the child based upon something like that. Now, it was a little bit different in that when the complaint was brought forward to the Employee Equity Office, it was done by the child's family, and they were not part of the city system. Normally, when I conducted internal investigations for the city, those were based on complaints for someone that worked with the city. During this situation, there were multiple witnesses about what occurred, but there was one witness in general who happened to work for the center director. And this person's version of events did not help the center director. In fact, it identified her as bopping hard on top of the child's head, risking serious injury. This was not directive touching. This was not something just to get the child's attention. This was literally a strike on that child, and of all places, hitting the child on the head, whereas we know that children's brains don't form until they get older, and that there's a significant safety risk for a child who's hit in the head. As this was an internal investigation, I interviewed the complainants first, then I interviewed the respondent and got the names of center employees that were present at the time, and then went ahead and conducted those interviews. One of the people that I interviewed who worked at the city center told me exactly what happened in terms of the child being struck on top of the head, that it wasn't directive touching, that it wasn't light, that this was an actual hit of a young child by not just a city employee, but the actual center director. And there was not a circumstance where this would be appropriate. The center director filed a lawsuit and refused to accept the investigation that I had conducted. At some point during depositions of this case, the guy that I had interviewed that identified exactly what happened, laid it all out, changed his testimony. All of a sudden, he didn't see the incident. All of a sudden, he couldn't imagine this being anything other than directive touching, and basically walking back everything he had told me. So this case ended up going to trial, and at trial, the kid took the stand to testify on behalf of the center director, but this time when he testified, he was handed a copy of the interview summary that I did for his interview, and lo and behold, he changed his testimony back to what it was originally, where it was very clear that the child had been struck by the center director, and that this was not just some kind of directive touching, but was an actual strike. Because of that change in testimony, the city of Albuquerque moved for a directed verdict after the plaintiffs had presented their case, and the judge granted the directed verdict, kicking out the case based upon the witnesses verifying what he had initially told me. And our final case is another litigation case, and interestingly enough, another law enforcement case. I used to do a lot of those. In this case, a young man who worked as a law librarian, who happened to be African American, at one of the bigger downtown law firms, was on his way home in a rental convertible from his engagement party. He had to go through kind of a little bit of a rough area, so he became aware of some law enforcement activity behind him. He initially thought that they were looking and involved in some type of motor vehicle stop that was gang related, but it turned out that they were actually tracking his vehicle and came up very fast to his vehicle, got him to pull over, climbed on back of the vehicle and began beating him because the convertible top was down. They beat him with their flashlights, they beat him with the knife stick, they beat him so badly that the D-ring for the seatbelt was mal-shaped because of the force level of the impact from the strikes from the officers. The officers thought, they suspected that the person who was beaten was a member of a gang, and also that he was somehow involved in the events that led up to his beating. So I conducted a lot of interviews in this case, but there were definitely some issues. Again, you have law enforcement who's given immediate credibility over our own client, who had suffered such a bad beating that he did not have a great recollection of the case because he literally suffered from significant close head trauma. On a Saturday, I went out and canvassed the neighborhood, going door to door, knocking on the door, speaking to whoever would open the door, and getting a sense of what took place and who might have further information. As I was just about to be done and heading back to my car, I noticed a stairway up to a couple of apartments. So I thought, why not? So I went upstairs, knocked on the door. When they opened the door, I introduced myself, and it turned out that one of the two women that lived in the apartment had gotten a single lens reflex camera with a nice long, like 135 millimeter lens for Christmas. I conducted an interview with both roommates, and they took me through what they saw, and in particular, the one student who had gotten the SLR camera, she watched the entire beating through the telephoto lens. Women had a lot to fear. They feared that if they lost the police protection in their neighborhood, that they would be at risk from some very bad elements that lived in their neighborhood. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Eventually, the case went to deposition, and with some hand-holding in terms of making sure that the witness was comfortable with her role, that she came and that she testified, she provided dynamic testimony about what took place. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department contested what looked to be a very difficult case now that we had an eyewitness. And in the end, they lost, and we won a significant sum of money. These are just 3 cases in which a single witness interview changed the outcome of the case. And it can work that way for you too. If you'd like to learn more about it, click on the link below and schedule a time where we'll look at how my 6-step witness interview process can be used by your organization. So just click on the link in the description below.